Welcome to this year's first technical webinar. We'll be running these sessions regularly throughout the year in partnership with various industry supply partners. So this webinar is brought to you in partnership with Lallemand Brewing, and we have Brittney Christianson here and also Sylvie Van Zandik from Lallemand Brewing. These webinars will be made available on our Asia Brewers Network website and our YouTube channel as a resource for brewers to reference. So please feel free to let your colleagues who may have missed the original broadcast know that these broadcasts will be available. If you can give us a few days just to edit the webinars once they've gone out live. We'll also be sending you links as well, so you can after this webinar we'll send you the link to it, and then they can you can access back or share it on with your colleagues. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues. So today's webinar is on yeast nutrition, and our guest presenter is Brittney Christianson. So based out of Portland, Oregon, Brittney is the West Coast Technical Sales Manager for Lallemand Brewing and has been with the company for 5 years. She has a degree from Oregon State University in Food Science and Technology, specializing in fermentation, and is a Northern California Technical Chair for the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. So today, Brittney will be providing an overview of yeast nutrition basics for all-wort and sugar-based fermentations. Her presentation will last about 20 minutes, after which we'll have a 25-minute question and answer session to answer all your questions on the presentation and the yeast nutritional requirements. So if you have any questions during the presentation, you can also feel free to ask those through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And Sylvie will be here to answer those. So Sylvie can answer those as Brittney's making her presentation. So Brittney, over to you.
All right, thank you. Let's share my screen and hopefully I can get it to work. All right. That worked. Do you see it in full screen?
Not yet.
I think it's because it's on this one. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try that again. Let's do this. Okay.
Yep, that's it.
Better?
Yep.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. Sorry about that. As said, my name is Brittney and I'm from Lallemand Brewing, and I'm going to be discussing a little bit about yeast nutrition today. We're going to do a quick nutrition overview, and we're going to be discussing what wort provides yeast and what do yeast really need to ferment properly, and going over the importance of a handful of nutrients, and then kind of really just briefly touch upon what's needed for sugar-based fermentations. So let's begin with the yeast cell. Yeasts are actually really complex. They're living cells. And in general, the ultimate goal of the cell is to take the nutrients and the kind of yeast foods that we provide them and produce more yeast. They really want to just kind of bud and produce more yeast. That's their end goal. And the great thing is that they also create all of these intermediates that we find really beneficial for when we're brewing beer. This can range from CO2, glycerol, esters, aldehydes and ketones, sulfur compounds, phenolic compounds, yeast autolytic compounds, acids, and alcohols. So when we're looking at yeast health, we also need to consider wort composition. And this is especially because the composition of wort can have an impact on many factors of yeast health and yeast performance. It can have an influence on the degree of attenuation and the overall fermentation performance, the amount of yeast produced. It can have a major impact on beer characteristics of the flavor, the foam, and aroma. And it can also have an influence on yeast flocculation. So what is actually available in wort and what do yeast need to use? So in wort, we have carbohydrates, and that's usually in the form of fermentable sugars. There's nitrogen sources, and that's usually in the source of amino acids. There's inorganic sources of various minerals and metals. There's oxygen that's provided, and then there's yeast foods, which are also vitamins, fatty acids, and sterols. I always kind of say that brewers are a bit spoiled in the fact that they get to work with wort as a starting substrate, because it's kind of offering an environment that the yeast, or at least giving the yeast kind of food that it wants. You don't really have to add too much because it's already kind of in the right sufficient limits of what the yeast is looking for. But there can also be some deficiencies that can happen even if you're doing all malt brewing, and that can be found with zinc deficiencies. They also found that there can be some deficiencies with biotin. And if you're ever doing high adjunct brewing or just adjunct brewing or high gravity brewing, there's also could be a need for adding more nitrogen, especially in adjunct brewing, because typically now your starting substrate of the wort is now going to be diluted. So you're going to need the extra supplementation. And a few little quotes that I always like to put up here is that yeast nutrition will dictate the speed and the extent of fermentation. And the quality of the yeast nutrition will also impact beer quality. And typically poor yeast nutrition and just poor yeast health overall can equal poor beer. It's all things that we need to keep in mind. And if we keep a correct array of these nutrients, that's how we will have successful fermentations. So nitrogen is incredibly important because without sufficient nitrogen, yeast will not ferment. When nitrogen is necessary for successful fermentations because it's transported into the cell, and then it's integrated into key proteins that are responsible for yeast cell function. So these proteins can then influence yeast performance and beer flavor. And commonly, the yeast are going to be utilizing amino acids that are found in wort. And that's because yeast cells have a general inability to utilize peptides and proteins. Ammonium salts are also another source that can be utilized by yeast. And typically, the fan levels or free amino nitrogen levels in wort should be around 150 milligrams per liter. And that should be enough for the for sufficient amount of nitrogen for the fermentation. So there's actually, well, you guys have probably heard how there's nitrogen can be kind of divided into these two categories of organic or inorganic sources of nitrogen. I just wanted to touch upon these two because I think it's important to know that, you know, an inorganic source of nitrogen, it can be, it's like ammonium salts or DAP is a good example. And both of these organic and inorganic sources are beneficial to the yeast and you're supplying a source of nitrogen to them. But there's found that there's challenges actually with some with inorganic sources of nitrogen. And it's kind of described here where the addition of these ammonium salts, this can lead to a rapid consumption of this by the yeast. And then the yeast will grow rapidly into a very, very large population. And this will then lead to a really quick decrease of the available nitrogen in the medium, which then will induce a nitrogen deficiency. And when that happens, the yeast kind of is stuck being left kind of consuming its own amino acids. And this can really stress the yeast out, which can lead to off flavors and specifically these kind of sulfur producing off flavors. So it's kind of a vicious cycle that can happen. And this is a good explanation to this graph over here on the right. And it kind of shows this is the release of CO2 over time. And you can see that whenever there's these ammonium salts that are added, it has this really big outburst of fermentation. There's a lot of heating, a lot of biomass increase, and there's this high cell mortality at the end of fermentation. And when you have this slow kind of like available nitrogen. This is kind of the organic nitrogen, and I like to kind of call it time release nitrogen. And the way that I think about it is kind of if you have candy and you're giving it, or even to yourself, you know, if someone gives you a bowl of candy and you eat it all at once, you might feel great really fast, but then quickly you're going to feel pretty terrible and not so good. But then if you are eating just a little bit over a week, you're going to have a much better time. And that's kind of in a way to think about the organic nitrogen, kind of the slow releasing, time released type of releasing of nitrogen versus the inorganic source that is just being uptake so quickly by the yeast cells. This brings me to kind of just discuss a new product that we're going to be launching soon. This is Yeast LiFeO, which is an organic nitrogen nutrient. It's 100% yeast autolysate nutrient. And it's a really well-balanced nutrient for yeast since it's 100% yeast autolysate. It's highly bioavailable, and it really contributes to this kind of cleaner and consistent fermentation. And again, it's organic, so it has that kind of time-released nitrogen release. And so in compared to another nutrient that we already have of our Yeast Life Extra, which is a blend, all of these kind of nutrients are already naturally present in Yeast LiFeO, which is really interesting. Next, we're moving to the importance of zinc. And so zinc is an essential trace element that can influence yeast performance and is also known as a cell membrane stabilizer. And this is because it can actually alleviate the stress of a cell. Yeast will also rapidly utilize zinc very early in the fermentation process, usually within the first hour. The zinc levels are going to be almost reduced down to 0. Zinc has been found to be commonly deficient in brewer's wort, and this is due to zinc binding typically to the kettles, and it also can precipitate out with the proteins during the boiling process. So this is something to maybe consider supplementing in all malt wort, especially in high gravity, and if you're serial repitching and so on. And it's really because zinc is very, very important. So it's a cofactor in several reactions, but most importantly, it's a cofactor for the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, or also known as the ADH enzyme. And this is the last enzyme in the fermentation pathway to produce alcohol. And zinc is necessary for this step. So it's pretty necessary to, you know, now have alcohol. Zinc requirements can be strain dependent, but on average, about 0.3 ppm is the minimum requirement. And you can tend to have stuck fermentations if zinc levels are around 0.1 ppm or less. We also have a product called Ceromyces, which is a zinc enriched yeast that we kind of have dedicated for this zinc supplementation. And it's really unique and kind of the only product that's like it on the market. And it's really interesting if you ever want to learn more about it. It has a cool history. So I just want to also mention propagation, or even if you're, again, serial repitching, it's something to think about. Yeast stores zinc in their vacuoles. And when yeast cells divide, the internal zinc pool is constantly dividing between the mother and the daughter cells. So in fermentation, there's typically this 4 to 5 time biomass increase. And in propagation, there's a 15 to 20 times biomass increase. So it's easy to see how this can result in really low internal zinc pools, just always kind of separating and separating. And low levels of zinc can lead to slower, less efficient propagations, and that can even lead to fermentation problems in the first generation. And if you're looking at this graph, this dark blue line is cells in suspension, and this is with the use of Ceromyces. And the red cell, the red line is cells in suspension as just the control without the use of Ceromyces for propagation. So there's a very large difference between the two of those. The next kind of, I say nutrient, but it's not necessarily an added nutrient, but it should still be mentioned because it's really important for yeast health, is oxygen. It's kind of injected separately. Yeast have variable requirements when it comes to how much oxygen is needed. It can be anything between 8 to 16 parts per million of DO prior to pitching. Or another rule of thumb is 1 ppm of oxygen per 1 degree Plato. And this is kind of the general practical level that's needed. Oxygen is actually a growth factor for biosynthesis of key membrane components. It enables the synthesis of sterols and unsaturated fatty acids. And these two things really help with maintaining membrane integrity. And then with that being said, it in turn also helps the yeast to be more tolerant during just any kind of stress that it encounters or the damaging effects of ethanol. I also made an extra note here that when using active dried yeast, injecting oxygen is not necessary on the first pitch. However, if you do it, it's also not harmful to the yeast. I know people who do, or especially if they're doing high gravity, a little bit of extra oxygenation is not going to be a problem. But remember, for subsequent pitches after the first pitch, you would still need to oxygenate. I also want to quickly kind of mention the importance of vitamins and minerals that are vital to the yeast and health and nutrition overall. So some metal ions, such as calcium, iron, and copper, are needed for cell growth, cell division, stress tolerance of yeast, and the maintenance of the cell structure. Calcium also has a very important role to play in yeast flocculation. Magnesium is an often overlooked but very essential. It's needed for the growth and cell division, and it's specifically required by many enzymes that are responsible for basically the beginning parts of glycolysis, where you have converting glucose to pyruvate to acetaldehyde. So it's really important for that kind of overly simplified glycolysis example, but you get the idea. Those enzymes really need magnesium, so it's essential. Vitamins are also necessary for overall yeast health. Biotin, pantothenic acid, and thiamine are critical for enzyme function and yeast growth. And vitamins are typically sufficiently supplied by the wort, but studies have also shown that biotin can be deficient. It's one of the more critical vitamins because it's a catalyst for multiple important reactions, such as amino acid metabolism, fatty acid biosynthesis, and energy metabolism. So the role of yeast nutrients can be broken down into these few pieces, and each section has a multifunctional role. Yeast foods are necessary to alleviate some stress, and it can provide extra sources of vitamins, metals, and nitrogen, which all have an influence on the overall yeast performance. And I like to think of yeast nutrients, yeast foods, whatever they're called, that's by each person, is I like to think of them kind of as like a yeast insurance. So, you know, it can help supplement when ingredients fall short. Maybe malt quality isn't so great. Also, if you're putting yeast into more stressful situations, they will need as much support as they can get. So to me, I think of it as an insurance. You know, why wouldn't you want to support the yeast and keep it healthy and, you know, try to maintain these consistent, healthy fermentations over and over again. And this is a paper that was done by Sylvie, and it's called The Impact of Yeast Nutrients on Fermentation Performance and Beer Quality. And I just wanted to go over this a little bit to just quickly show the benefits of just added nutrients to a fermentation. So this example here is 100% malt extract. So, and then we have generation 1 and generation 8. And in the first generation, you can see that, you know, obviously there's not a clear benefit of the added nutrients, but by generation 8, there's definitely the benefit of Cerbomyces and yeast life. And this is yeast life extra. I made a note because it can be confusing with the new product that's about to launch. And But I think the big takeaway, at least from this slide, is that with these added nutrients, you're keeping the yeast healthier and you're having these more consistent fermentations. And I think that's kind of what people are looking for at the end of the day. This is from the same study, but they did a 60% malt and then 40% just sugar kind of syrup that was added. So it was kind of like a high adjunct type fermentation. And this one is, I think it's even more clear on the 2 generations. I mean, you have your first generation and there's this red line right here is the control. And you can see a great, impact and difference between the nutrients being added versus the control, even on the first generation. Whereas over here in generation 8, I think it's even more apparent. This red line is the control, and with the added nutrients, it just benefited the fermentations each time. And yeah, I think this might be my last slide. I'm powering through. So this is just a kind of brief touch upon sugar-based fermentations. Honestly, I think you could probably have a full presentation about sugar-based fermentations from a nutrient standpoint. And I know since I only had 20 minutes, I wanted to keep it brief. But I think this really kind of is telling, where we have over here what wort offers yeast. And we know that wort offers sugars, nitrogen, vitamins, minerals. Like I said before, it's really like this kind of spoiled starting substrate. It's giving you what you want. But then we have over here for sugar-based fermentations and what sugars offer us, right? It just offers us sugar. So nutrients really need to be supplemented for these type of fermentations. It's not really an easy fermentation on yeast. I highly recommend talking to your yeast or your nutrient supplier for recommendations on your process. From at least my experience, each brewery and producer has different needs of what they're looking for in the final product. Their starting gravities are all different. The equipment that they're using can be, different, and whatever they're kind of starting with. So, I think there's a lot of details that go into it. So I really recommend talking to your yeast or nutrient supplier. And I think another kind of point to make, and without sounding too harsh, is, kind of keeping expectations in line, because I think a lot of people are expecting to get a hard seltzer beverage that is as crystal clear as some of these bigger brands, and they're not seeing that. And, and that's perfectly normal, actually. For example, right here, these 2 pictures, it's not as terrible of like haze or color that you would think by me saying that. But this is just a seltzer sample from our lab, and this is unfiltered, and then over to the right is the filtered version. And as you can see, there is a little bit of slight haze, and there is also a little tint of color. It's not super as perfectly clear. And I just want to let people know that that is very common, and just to have those kind of going in with those expectations if you don't know that yet. So it's just something to think about, and I think a lot of people are discussing that a bit more. So yeah, last slide. Hopefully I didn't run through that too fast. I know I have a tendency to talk fast. But yeah, the summary is just the yeasts need the right nutrition to function properly. It's already a semi-stressful environment to them. They're not the happiest. Just kind of give the yeast what they are looking for, and they're going to do the job for you. And if you have poor yeast health, that should say health, not teeth, that can lead to your poor beer, poor final product, and not giving you the expectations that you're looking for. And yeast nutrients can also be used as a yeast insurance. So even in all malt brewing, you might not think it's necessary, but there can also still be a lot of benefits, especially in that zinc deficiencies, possible biotin deficiencies, and then just providing your yeast vitamins and minerals that they would still like to have, more of. So that's kind of it for me.